Every county in Georgia keeps birth records, marriage certificates, death certificates, tax ledgers, property deeds. These documents form the skeleton of history, proof that people existed, that families lived, that lives had meaning. But in Fairmont County, Georgia, there's a gap. Not a small one, not a missing page or a water-damaged volume. Between 1847 and 1865, over 300 names simply disappeared. 300 people who were born, who worked, who died, erased so completely that only their absence remains. And here's what makes it impossible to ignore. Every single one of them was connected to the same place, Riverside Plantation. The estate itself still stands today, converted into a historic site with manicured gardens and guided tours. But ask about the families who lived there, who built those brick walls and tended those fields, and you'll find something disturbing. The official record falls silent, as if those souls never drew breath. This is the story of how an entire community was methodically removed from history, and why someone went to such extraordinary lengths to make sure they stayed forgotten. Thomas Hargrave wasn't looking for a mystery when he inherited his grandmother's house in 1962. He was a 28-year-old junior professor of American history at Emory University, specializing in Reconstruction-era economics. His grandmother, Eleanor Hargrave, had passed away at 91, leaving him her modest home on the outskirts of Fairmont County and a cluttered attic full of 8 decades worth of collected papers, photographs, and correspondence. Thomas drove down on a humid Saturday in June, windows rolled down, radio playing softly. He'd loved his grandmother, a sharp-minded woman who'd taught elementary school for 40 years and never missed a Sunday at First Baptist Church. She'd raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. The house held good memories, summer visits, sweet tea on the porch, her stories about growing up in rural Georgia. But Eleanor had also been a hoarder of paper. Every letter, every receipt, every church bulletin, she'd kept it all, organized in boxes labeled with her careful handwriting. Thomas spent the first week sorting through the parlor and bedrooms, setting aside items for donation, packing up kitchen goods. The attic he saved for last. When he finally climbed the narrow stairs on the following Saturday, pulling the cord to switch on the single bulb, he found exactly what he'd expected. Towers of cardboard boxes, an old dressmaker's mannequin, stacks of National Geographic magazines, a steamer trunk. What he didn't expect was the leather case. It sat on a high shelf, partially hidden behind a hat box. Dark brown, about the size of a briefcase, with tarnished brass clasps. The leather was cracked with age, but still intact. Thomas pulled it down, blew off the dust, and opened it. Inside were documents, old documents. Some on parchment, some on yellowed paper, all carefully organized in folders tied with ribbon. The first folder was labeled in faded ink. Riverside Plantation, Estate Records, 1835, 1866. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. As a historian, he knew the value of primary sources. Plantation records from the antebellum period were rare, often destroyed during the war or lost to time. This was a genuine find. He carried the case downstairs, cleared the dining table, and began to examine the contents. There were bills of sale, crop yields, correspondence between the plantation owner, a man named Nathaniel Wycliffe, and various merchants, banks, and cotton factors, detailed inventories of farm equipment, livestock, building repairs. And then, tucked in the back of the third folder, Thomas found something that made him stop cold. A ledger page, handwritten in meticulous script, dated April 1847. At the top, Riverside Estate, Quarterly Census of Enslaved Persons. Below that, a list. Names, ages, family groupings. 73 individuals from an infant named Rose to an elderly man named Abraham, listed as 68 years old. But here's what struck Thomas as strange. Next to each name in the margin was a small notation in different ink. Transferred, March 1848. Every single one. 73 people transferred in the same month. Thomas frowned. Mass sales weren't unheard of, plantations failed, owners died, estates were liquidated. But usually, there'd be a corresponding bill of sale, a record of who purchased them, where they went. He searched through the rest of the documents. Nothing. No bills of sale, no receipts, no letters referencing the transfer. Just that single notation, transferred. And then, nothing. Thomas couldn't let it go. Back in Atlanta, he reached out to colleagues who specialized in Southern plantation history. He wrote to the Georgia Historical Society. He sent inquiries to the Fairmont County Clerk's office, requesting access to property records, tax assessments, anything that might shed light on what happened to those 73 people. What came back puzzled him even more. The Fairmont County Clerk, a woman named Mrs. Dunlap, responded with a polite but firm letter stating that while general records were available, certain documents related to Riverside Plantation were restricted due to ongoing legal complications regarding property boundaries and heir disputes. Thomas found this odd. The plantation had been converted into a state historic site in 1953. What legal complications could there be a decade later? He drove back to Fairmont County and visited the clerk's office in person. Mrs. Dunlap was a severe woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled into a tight bun, reading glasses on a chain. She received Thomas in a small office that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. "Dr. Hargrave," she said, consulting a notepad, "you're requesting records related to Riverside Plantation from 1847 to 1865. That's correct. May I ask the nature of your research?" Thomas explained his academic interest, his discovery of the ledger in his grandmother's attic, the mysterious transfer notation. Mrs. Dunlap's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on her pen. "I'm afraid those records are not available for public viewing." "But you said there are legal complications. What kind?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing legal matters." "Mrs. Dunlap, these are historical documents. They belong in the public record, under Georgia law." "I'm aware of the law, Dr. Hargrave." Her voice had gone cold. "And I'm telling you those files are sealed. If you wish to challenge that determination, you're welcome to file a formal request with the county attorney." Thomas left frustrated but undeterred. He filed the formal request. 6 weeks later, it was denied without explanation. So he tried a different approach. Thomas began working backward through public records that were accessible. He started with the 1850 federal census, the first census to record enslaved people by name in some cases, though most were still listed only by age and sex under the slaveholder's name. He found Nathaniel Wycliffe's entry easily. Wycliffe, age 49, listed as a planter. Property value, substantial. The census recorded his household as including his wife, Margaret, 3 children, and a white overseer. Below that, under slave schedule, no entries. 0 enslaved persons listed. Thomas checked the date, June 1850. According to the ledger from his grandmother's attic, 73 people had been transferred in March 1848. So it made sense that Wycliffe wouldn't list them in 1850. They were gone. But here's what didn't make sense. Thomas pulled the 1840 census. In 1840, Riverside Plantation had listed 61 enslaved persons. By 1847, the private ledger showed 73. Then in 1848, they were all transferred. And in 1850, Wycliffe listed 0. But when Thomas checked the 1860 census, something impossible appeared. Nathaniel Wycliffe, now listed as 59 years old, showed 82 enslaved persons on his property. 82. Where had they come from? If Wycliffe had sold off his entire workforce in 1848, how did he rebuild to an even larger number by 1860? And why was there no record of purchases in between? Thomas cross-referenced with county tax records, public documents that couldn't be sealed. The 1848 tax assessment for Riverside listed property value, but no enslaved persons. The 1849 assessment, same. 1850 through 1856, same. Then suddenly in 1857, the tax assessment jumped. Riverside was now being taxed for 79 enslaved individuals. By 1860, that number was 82. It was as if an entire workforce had appeared out of nowhere. And here's the detail that made Thomas's blood run cold. In the 1860 slave schedule, the ages didn't match any logical pattern. If these were purchased slaves, you'd expect a range of ages. People bought from different sources at different times. But the age distribution at Riverside was unusual. Clusters of children aged 10-13, young adults aged 22-25, and a handful of elders around 60. Almost as if a community had simply skipped a decade of aging. Thomas needed another source, something outside official government records. He turned to church registries. Plantation owners in the antebellum South often required enslaved people to attend services. Baptisms, marriages, and deaths were sometimes recorded in church ledgers, even if they weren't documented by the state. Fairmont County had 3 churches operating in the 1840s. 2 had lost their records in a fire during Sherman's March. But the third, Fairmont Methodist Episcopal Church, had preserved its records in a fireproof vault. Thomas visited on a Tuesday afternoon. The current minister, Reverend Polk, was a friendly man in his 50s who welcomed academic research. "We don't get many historians," Polk said, leading Thomas to a back room. "Most people are genealogists looking for family connections." The ledgers were stored in acid-free boxes, surprisingly well preserved. Thomas started with the volume covering 1845-1855. He found entries for Riverside Plantation quickly. March 1847, baptism of infant Rose, daughter of Hannah, Riverside Plantation. June 1847, marriage of Samuel and Dinah, Riverside Plantation. November 1847, burial of Abraham, aged approximately 68, Riverside Plantation. Normal entries. Lives documented with the sparse dignity the church could offer. Then, in February 1848, there was something different, a mass baptism. 43 people, all listed as of Riverside Plantation, baptized on the same Sunday. The names were written in a hurried hand, as if the recorder was overwhelmed by the number. Men, women, children, all receiving the sacrament at once. And then, after March 1848, nothing. No more births at Riverside, no marriages, no deaths. For 9 years, the plantation simply vanished from the church record. Then, in January 1857, entries began again. Baptism of an infant, burial of an elderly woman, marriage of a young couple, all listed as of Riverside Plantation. But the names were different. None of the names from 1847 appeared in the 1857 entries. It was as if the entire population had been swapped. Thomas sat back, his mind racing. Reverend Polk noticed his expression. "Find something interesting? Reverend, do you have any correspondence from that period? Letters, notes from ministers, anything that might explain church activities?" Polk considered. "There might be some material in the archives. Let me check." He returned 15 minutes later with a thin folder. "This is what we have from Reverend Martin Hayes, who served here from 1843 to 1851. Thomas opened it carefully. Most were routine notes, sermon topics, visiting preachers, building maintenance. But near the back, he found a letter dated April 10th, 1848, addressed to the Bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church, South. Thomas read it twice. "Your Grace, I write to request guidance on a matter of considerable spiritual distress. In recent weeks, I have been approached by members of the Riverside congregation expressing grave concerns regarding the whereabouts of their kin. Families have been separated without explanation, and when I sought clarity from Mr. Wycliffe, I was informed in no uncertain terms that church inquiry into his affairs was unwelcome. I am torn between my duty to my congregation and the constraints placed upon me by local custom. These souls came to the Lord's house seeking comfort, and I fear I have failed them. I await your counsel. Respectfully, Reverend Martin Hayes." Thomas looked up at Reverend Polk. "Is there a response?" Polk shook his head. "Not in our files." Thomas photographed the letter with his camera, thanked the Reverend, and drove back to Atlanta. That night, he couldn't sleep. Families separated. A minister silenced. An entire workforce vanishing from records, only to be replaced years later. What had happened at Riverside Plantation? Thomas expanded his search. If 300 people had been transferred from Riverside, there had to be a paper trail somewhere. Bank records, shipping manifests, something. He contacted the Georgia State Archives and requested any records related to Nathaniel Wycliffe or Riverside Plantation between 1845 and 1865. What arrived 3 weeks later was a slim folder containing mostly duplicates of what he'd already found. But there was one new item, a brief mention in the Georgia General Assembly Journal from 1849. A legislative appropriation had been approved for the expansion of the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. The asylum had been founded in 1842 as the first public mental institution in the state. The 1849 expansion added a new wing and increased capacity significantly. Thomas almost passed over it. What did an asylum have to do with Riverside? But then he noticed a footnote referencing a private endowment from Nathaniel Wycliffe, Fairmont County, for the construction of agricultural facilities. An endowment from Wycliffe. In 1849, 1 year after the mysterious transfer, Thomas requested records from the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum. What came back was disturbing. The asylum had indeed received a significant endowment from Wycliffe, $12,000, an enormous sum at the time. The money funded construction of a farm complex on the asylum grounds, fields, livestock pens, workshops. And according to the asylum's annual reports, the farm was worked by patients engaged in therapeutic labor. The 1850 asylum report listed 81 patients employed in agricultural work. The 1851 report listed 94. The 1855 report listed 112. But here's what made Thomas's hands shake as he read. The asylum kept patient admission records, names, ages, counties of origin, diagnoses. Thomas requested access. The archive staff informed him that patient records were confidential under state law, even historical ones, unless he could demonstrate direct familial connection. He couldn't, but the asylum's annual statistical reports were public. Thomas combed through them. In the 1850 report, there was a breakdown by county of origin. Fairmont County, 68 patients. For a rural county with a total population of around 3,200, that number was statistically impossible. Mental illness didn't strike one county at 20 times the normal rate, unless those weren't patients. Thomas felt ice in his stomach. Thomas needed proof. He reached out to a colleague at the University of Georgia, Dr. Patricia Chen, who specialized in the history of mental institutions in the South. Over lunch in Athens, he explained what he'd found. Patricia listened, her expression growing more serious. "Thomas, what you're describing sounds like a diagnostic loophole," she said. In the 1840s and 50s, the definition of insanity was flexible, especially when it came to enslaved people. "What do you mean?" "There was a diagnosis called drapetomania, literally the disease that causes slaves to run away. Another one was dysesthesia ethiopica, supposedly caused laziness and disobedience. These were invented conditions used to pathologize resistance. You're saying enslaved people could be committed to asylums for not wanting to be enslaved?" Patricia nodded grimly. "In theory, yes, but it was rare because asylums cost money. Why pay to institutionalize someone when you could just punish them on your own property? Unless," Thomas said slowly, "you had another reason." "Like what?" Thomas pulled out his notes. "What if you needed to hide people, make them disappear from the public record, but still profit from their labor?" Patricia's eyes widened. God, that's diabolical. An asylum would be perfect. They're closed institutions, no public access. Patients have no legal rights. And if you funded the asylum's farm operation, you'd have a steady supply of free labor that's completely off the books. "But what about the families? You said entire families vanished." Thomas had thought about this. Families were units, If you wanted to erase someone's existence, you couldn't just take the adults. Children would grow up, tell stories, remember parents who were documented elsewhere. You'd have to take everyone, parents, children, even infants. Make it look like they never existed at all. Patricia was silent for a long moment. "You need to see those patient records," she finally said. "They're sealed. There might be another way." Patricia had a contact, a retired archivist named Mr. Osborne, who'd worked at the Georgia State Hospital, the modern name for the old asylum, for 30 years before retiring in 1959. He lived in Milledgeville, in a small house near the hospital grounds. Thomas drove down to meet him on a sweltering afternoon in August. Mr. Osborne was 83, thin and stooped, but his mind was sharp. He invited Thomas into a study lined with books and personal files. "Dr. Chen called me," Osborne said, lowering himself into a leather chair. "Said you're researching the old asylum farm." "Yes, sir. Specifically admissions from Fairmont County between 1848 and 1856. Osborne nodded slowly. "I remember those records." "You do?" "Hard to forget. When I first started working in the archives back in 29, I was cataloging patient files from the 1840s and 50s. There was a whole section, maybe 100 files, all from Fairmont County, all admitted within a few years of each other. What happened to them?" Osborne's face darkened. "They were removed." "Removed? By who?" "Hospital administration." This was around 1931. "Said there was a legal request from descendants, something about privacy. The files were packed up and sent to the State Attorney General's office." He paused. "But here's the thing. I'd already read some of them." Thomas leaned forward. "What did they say?" Osborne stood slowly, walked to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a worn notebook. "I kept notes. Wasn't supposed to, but something felt wrong about those cases." He handed the notebook to Thomas. The pages were filled with Osborne's careful handwriting. "Patient 847029, female, age 24, Fairmont County. Diagnosis, moral deficiency and hereditary melancholia. Admitted March 1848. Notes indicate patient is physically sound, capable of field labor. Assigned to farm detail. Patient 847031, male, age 19, Fairmont County. Diagnosis, idleness and resistance to discipline. Admitted March 1848. No evidence of mental disturbance. Assigned to farm detail. Patient 847044, female infant, age 8 months, Fairmont County. Diagnosis, at risk of inherited insanity. Admitted March 1848 with mother, patient 847043, assigned to nursery labor. Thomas felt sick. An 8-month-old baby, diagnosed as insane. "Mr. Osborne, these people weren't patients." "No," Osborne said quietly. "They weren't." "Did your notes say anything about who committed them?" Osborne flipped to another page. "All admission papers signed by Dr. Cyrus Brennan, Fairmont County physician, and co-signed by Magistrate Samuel Holt. Commitments authorized under Georgia Code, Section 17, Subsection 4. Persons of unsound mind posing danger to themselves or others." Thomas wrote down the names. "Do you remember anything else?" Osborne hesitated. "There was one file I read that stayed with me. A woman, maybe 30 years old. Her diagnosis was listed as religious mania. The intake notes said she'd been found preaching sedition and encouraging disobedience among others of her race." "What was her name?" Osborne checked his notebook. "Patient 84702, Judith. No surname recorded." Back in Atlanta, Thomas researched Dr. Cyrus Brennan. County records showed Brennan had practiced medicine in Fairmont County from 1844 until his death in 1872. He'd served as county physician, a position that gave him authority to sign commitment papers for the asylum. Thomas found Brennan's personal papers in the archives of the Medical College of Georgia. Most were unremarkable. Patient records, fee ledgers, correspondence about medical supplies. But in a folder labeled Professional Correspondence 1848, Thomas found a letter from Nathaniel Wycliffe. "Dr. Brennan, I write to confirm our arrangement regarding the matter we discussed. The sum of $300 will be forwarded upon completion of the documentation. I trust your discretion in this affair, as the reputation of my estate and the stability of our community depend upon it. The individuals in question pose a risk, as you know, and their removal to the state facility serves both public safety and Christian charity. Yours in confidence, Nathaniel Wycliffe. Thomas read it 3 times. It was carefully worded, nothing explicitly incriminating. But the meaning was clear. Wycliffe had paid Brennan to falsify commitment papers. But why? What risk did 73 people, including infants, pose? Thomas needed to understand Wycliffe himself. Thomas drove to Riverside Plantation, now operated by the Georgia Historical Society as a museum. The estate was beautiful in a haunting way, a white-columned mansion overlooking the Oconee River, surrounded by ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The old slave quarters had been reconstructed for educational purposes, and the tour guides offered a sanitized version of plantation life. Thomas paid for the tour, then asked to speak with the site director, Mr. Eugene Cartwright. Cartwright was a heavy-set man in his 50s, enthusiastic about local history, but clearly unaccustomed to serious academic inquiry. Dr. Hargrave, welcome. Always happy to assist researchers. Thomas showed him copies of the ledger from his grandmother's attic. I'm trying to trace what happened to the people listed here. 73 individuals, all marked as transferred in 1848. Do you have any estate records that might explain this? Cartwright studied the document, frowning. This is remarkable. I've never seen this ledger before. Where did you say you found it? My grandmother's attic. She lived in Fairmont County her whole life. Fascinating. Cartwright handed it back. But I'm afraid we don't have records from that period. Most of Riverside's papers were destroyed during the war. The county clerk mentioned ongoing legal issues. Do you know anything about that? Cartwright's friendly demeanor shifted slightly. Yes, there's been a complication. Some descendants of the Wycliffe family have disputed the state's ownership of certain historical materials. It's been in litigation for years. Which descendants? I'm not at liberty to say. There it was again, that wool. Thomas tried another angle. Mr. Cartwright, did Riverside have a cemetery? Of course. There's the family plot on the hill, where the Wycliffes are buried. What about a cemetery for enslaved people? Cartwright hesitated. There are unmarked graves on the east side of the property near the old fields. We've never excavated them out of respect. How many graves? We don't know exactly, maybe 100, possibly more. Can I see it? The cemetery, if it could be called that, was a clearing in the pines, maybe 50 yards from what had been the cotton fields. The ground was uneven with subtle depressions marking where graves had settled over time. No headstones, no markers, just earth and pine needles. Thomas walked slowly through the space, counting the depressions. He estimated close to 90 graves. But if Riverside had operated for decades, housing 60 to 80 enslaved people at any given time, there should have been far more burials. Disease, childbirth complications, accidents, old age. The death rate on plantations was tragically high. 90 graves seemed too few, unless people had been buried elsewhere, or not buried at all. Thomas felt the weight of it, the deliberate erasure, the methodical removal of evidence. He returned to the main house and asked Cartwright one more question. When did Nathaniel Wycliffe die? 1867, 2 years after the war ended. Is there a will? Cartwright blinked. I'd have to check. Could you? The will was on file at the Fairmont County Courthouse, a public document. Thomas obtained a copy the following week. It was a standard document for the time, distribution of property to Wycliffe's widow and 3 surviving children, provisions for debts to be paid from the estate. But there was a clause near the end that made Thomas stop breathing. Item 7. I direct my executors to destroy all personal ledgers, correspondence, and records pertaining to estate operations between the years 1847 and 1856, inclusive, as said documents contain matters of private business not suitable for public examination. This destruction shall be completed within 60 days of my death and verified by sworn affidavit. Destroy the records. Not preserve them. Not archive them. Destroy them. And according to a notarized affidavit attached to the will, dated September 1867, Wycliffe's son-in-law, Howard Preston, confirmed that all documents specified in Item 7 had been burned in accordance with the testator's wishes. Thomas sat in the courthouse reading room, the afternoon light slanting through tall windows. He now had pieces of a pattern, but not the full picture. 73 people vanished from Riverside in March 1848, mass commitment to the asylum under false diagnoses, 9 years of silence in all records, sudden reappearance of an enslaved workforce in 1857, a will demanding destruction of evidence. But he still didn't know why. What had Wycliffe been hiding? The answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas was presenting his preliminary research at a conference on Southern economic history in November 1962. During the Q&A, an elderly professor from Duke University approached him. "Dr. Hargrave, I was intrigued by your mention of Nathaniel Wycliffe. I came across that name years ago in a different context." "Oh? Railroad contracts." "I was researching the construction of the Central of Georgia Railway in the 1840s. Wycliffe's name appeared in connection with a labor contract." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "Do you remember the details?" "Not precisely, but I can send you the citation." 2 weeks later, Thomas was in the archives of the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, reading through construction contracts from 1847. And there it was. Contract dated November 1847 between the Central of Georgia Railway and Nathaniel Wycliffe for the lease of 70 able-bodied workers for railroad construction, term of 9 years, compensation $40 per worker per annum. 70 workers for 9 years. Thomas did the math. 70 workers, x 40, x 9 years, 25 to 200. A fortune. But the contract had a peculiar clause. Lessor agrees to provide workers free of encumbrance and guarantees no legal claims shall arise from their employment. Lessor assumes all liability for worker welfare, discipline, and housing. Company shall not be responsible for documentation or registration of said workers. Translation: Wycliffe would provide workers with no paper trail, and the railroad wouldn't ask questions. But there was a problem. You couldn't lease enslaved people to a railroad company and just pretend they didn't exist. Slaves were property. They appeared on tax rolls, estate inventories, insurance policies, unless they weren't slaves anymore. Unless they were something else. Asylum patients. Thomas felt the full picture crystallizing. Wycliffe had committed his entire workforce to the asylum under false pretenses, then immediately leased them to the railroad company as patient laborers. The asylum got an endowment. The railroad got cheap labor with no legal complications. And Wycliffe got thousands of dollars in profit from people he no longer legally owned. It was slavery laundered through medicine. But there was still a missing piece. If the contract ended in 1856 and Riverside had enslaved people again by 1857, what happened to the original 73? Thomas returned to the census records. He'd been looking at numbers, head counts, ages, totals. Now he looked at names. The 1860 slave schedule didn't record names for enslaved people in most cases, but Thomas cross-referenced with the church baptism records from 1857 onward. He found 15 names that appeared in both the 1847 ledger and the 1857 church records. 15 people who'd supposedly been transferred in 1848 were back at Riverside by 1857, but their ages were wrong. Example: 1847, ledger, Hannah, age 22. 1857 church record, Hannah, age 27, should be 32. Another, 1847 ledger, Samuel, age 28. 1857 church record, Samuel, age 30, should be 38. It was as if they'd lost years, or as if they'd been replaced by younger people given the same names. Thomas considered this. Enslaved people often had limited surnames and names were reused. It was possible these were different individuals. But 15 matching names seemed beyond coincidence. Then Thomas found something in the asylum's 1856 annual report that chilled him. A notation in the financial section. Closure of agricultural labor program. Upon expiration of external contracts, farm operations reduced. Patient transfers, 41 returned to counties of origin. 27 transferred to state penitentiary. 18 deceased. Returned to counties of origin. 41 people sent back. Thomas checked the numbers. The asylum had listed 68 Fairmont County patients in 1850. By 1856, accounting for deaths and penitentiary transfers, around 40-45 would have been available for return. The math matched, but here's what didn't match. If those people were returned to Fairmont County, they should have appeared in the records. Thomas checked the 1857 county tax assessments for Riverside. 79 enslaved persons listed. But the age distribution was all wrong for people who'd spent 9 years in an asylum. There were too many young children, kids who would have been born during the asylum years, which meant either 1. The returned patients had children at the asylum, possible but unlikely given the harsh conditions. 2. Or Wycliffe had acquired a new workforce entirely, and the returned patients went somewhere else. Or option 3, the one Thomas didn't want to consider. The returned patients never made it back to any record at all. Thomas requested records from the Georgia State Penitentiary in Milledgeville. The response took 6 weeks. When it arrived, Thomas opened the envelope with shaking hands. The penitentiary had maintained detailed inmate records, and unlike the asylum, these were public after a certain period. Thomas scanned the admission logs for 1856. There they were. 27 inmates, all transferred from the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum in December 1856. All listed as colored, all from Fairmont County. Their crimes were listed as vagrancy, refusal to labor, disturbing the peace, incitement. Prison sentences, 20 years for vagrancy. Thomas looked at the names. He recognized several from the 1847 Riverside Ledger. Marcus, listed as age 34 in the prison record, would have been 25 in 1847, math matched. Judith, age 38, would have been 29 in 1847, close enough. Samuel, age 36, would have been 28 in 1847, matched. These were the same people. They'd been sent from Riverside to the asylum in 1848, leased to the railroad for 9 years, then transferred to the penitentiary in 1856 when the contract ended. And in prison, they would have continued to work. Penitentiary labor was common, often leased out to private companies. Thomas checked the discharge records. Of the 27 transferred from the asylum, 11 died in custody between 1857 and 1864. 14 were listed as released in 1865, released. The same year the war ended, the same year slavery was abolished, but released to where? Thomas found no further record of those 14 individuals, no census entries, no church records, no death certificates. They simply vanished. Thomas knew he was missing something, the human element. Numbers and ledgers told part of the story, but somewhere there had to be people who remembered. He placed an advertisement in the Fairmont County Gazette, the local newspaper. Researchers seeking information about families connected to Riverside Plantation, 1840s, 1860s. Contact Dr. Thomas Hargrave, Emory University. He received 3 responses. The first was from a genealogist working on her family tree. Interesting, but not directly relevant. The second was from an elderly man who claimed his great-uncle had worked at Riverside after the war, but his dates didn't match Thomas's research. The third was from a woman named Lucille Bennett. Her letter was brief. Dr. Hargrave, my grandmother spoke of Riverside. She said her people came from there, but the records were taken. She passed in 1958, but before she died, she gave me a Bible. Inside are names. I think they might help you. Please call Mrs. Lucille Bennett. Thomas called that evening. Lucille was 72, living in Macon. Her voice was strong, clear. Dr. Hargrave, thank you for reaching out. My grandmother was named Clara, and she always said our family came from the river place. That's what she called Riverside. But she said the white folks took the names away. Took them away how? She never explained exactly. Just said that after the war, when people tried to register to vote or claim land, they'd go to the courthouse and there'd be no record they'd ever existed. No birth records, no marriage records. Nothing. Did she say why? She thought it was to keep people from claiming what was owed to them. If you were never documented as existing, you couldn't prove you'd been enslaved there, couldn't make claims for back wages or land. Thomas felt the pieces falling into place. Mrs. Bennet, you mentioned a Bible with names? Yes. It belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Judith. She could write a little, taught herself. She wrote names inside the front cover. Family names, I think. People she wanted to remember. Thomas's heart nearly stopped. Judith? That's right. Mrs. Bennet, would you be willing to show me that Bible? Thomas drove to Macon the following Saturday. Lucille Bennet lived in a neat bungalow with a well-tended garden. She welcomed him with iced tea and homemade pound cake. The Bible sat on the coffee table wrapped in a faded cloth. Lucille unwrapped it carefully. It was a small King James Bible, leather cover worn smooth by handling. The gilding on the pages had faded to a dull bronze. She opened it to the front cover. There, in careful but unpracticed handwriting, was a list of names. Hannah and Baby Rose, Samuel and Dinah Marcus Abraham, gone to rest, Judith Esther, and 3 children Isaac and Rachel. And more, maybe 30 names in total. At the bottom, in slightly different ink, a note. These souls lived, let it be known. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. May I photograph this? Lucille nodded. That's why I called you. These names deserve to be remembered. Thomas carefully photographed each page, then asked, Mrs. Bennet, what happened to Judith after the war? Lucille smiled sadly. Grandmother Clara said Judith lived to be very old. She'd been through something terrible. Clara never knew exactly what, but Judith had scars on her wrists and wouldn't talk about the lost years. She lived in a small cabin near Macon, took in washing, raised Clara after Clara's mother died young. Did Judith ever try to find the others? The people from Riverside? Clara said she did. Spent years writing letters, visiting churches, asking travelers if they'd seen anyone from the old days. But most were gone, scattered or just gone. Thomas showed Lucille his research. The asylum records, the railroad contract, the penitentiary transfers. Lucille listened, her face growing drawn. So they were worked twice, she said quietly. Once as slaves, then again as prisoners. I think some of them survived, Thomas said. 14 were released in 1865. Judith was one of them. And the others? I don't know. That's what I'm trying to find out. Thomas returned to his research with renewed focus. 73 people had been committed to the asylum. 27 were transferred to the penitentiary. That left 46 unaccounted for from the asylum's 1856 records. The asylum report had said 41 returned to counties of origin. But Thomas could only find evidence of 15 returning to Riverside based on matching names in later records. Where were the other 26? He went back through the asylum's annual reports, looking for mortality data. The asylum reported deaths each year, but the numbers were aggregated. No names, no details. However, in the 1851 report, there was an unusual spike. Patient deaths, 1851. 34, primarily from typhoid fever outbreak in agricultural quarters. 34 deaths in 1 year. Thomas checked the asylum's total patient population in 1851, around 200. A death rate of 17% in a single year was catastrophic, far beyond normal even for an asylum. And agricultural quarters meant the farm workers, the people from Riverside. Thomas found a mention of the outbreak in a Milledgeville newspaper from August 1851. The state asylum reports an unfortunate contagion among patients employed in farm labor. Authorities assure the public there is no risk to the broader community. That was it. One paragraph. 34 deaths, dismissed in a single paragraph. Thomas wondered if anyone had even been notified. Did families back in Fairmont County know their loved ones had died? Were bodies returned for burial? He found the answer in the asylum's administrative records. Indigent patient burials, interred on hospital grounds in unmarked graves, no funds allocated for individual markers. They'd been buried at the asylum. Anonymous, forgotten. Thomas requested access to the old asylum cemetery. The Georgia State Hospital still operated in Milledgeville, though much reduced from its peak. The old cemetery was behind the modern buildings, a neglected patch of land surrounded by a rusted fence. Thomas visited on a cold morning in January 1963. A hospital administrator accompanied him, a younger man named Mr. Ridley, who seemed uncomfortable with the visit. "We don't usually allow access," Ridley said, "but given your research credentials." The graveyard was larger than Thomas expected. Rows of small, weathered stones, most illegible. Many graves had no markers at all, just depressions in the earth like the ones at Riverside. "How many burials?" Thomas asked. "We estimate over 1,000 from 1842 to around 1900. "Are there records of who's buried here?" Ridley shook his head. "Spotty at best. A lot of patients were admitted with no family contact, no next of kin. When they died, they were buried here." Thomas walked among the graves, looking for anything from 1851. He found a section with a few dated stones, 1849, 1850, 1852. But for 1851, the year of the typhoid outbreak, there were no individual markers, just a long, low area where the ground had settled, indicating multiple graves. "Mr. Ridley, was there a mass burial site from the typhoid epidemic?" Ridley consulted a map he'd brought. "According to this old survey, yes. That area there." He pointed to the depression. 30 to 40 graves unmarked. Thomas stood there in the cold, looking at the anonymous earth. 34 people who'd been stolen from their families, falsely imprisoned, worked until they died, and buried without a name. And somewhere, records had been deliberately altered to make sure no one would ever connect them back to Riverside Plantation. Thomas spent the next months trying to break through the sealed records at Fairmont County. He filed Freedom of Information requests. He contacted state legislators. He even wrote to the governor's office. Every request was denied. The reasons varied: ongoing litigation, privacy concerns, administrative backlog. But Thomas noticed a pattern. Every denial came through the office of the Fairmont County attorney, Mr. Douglas Fairchild. Thomas researched Fairchild. He'd been county attorney since 1951, appointed by the county commission. Before that, his father had held the position. And before that, his grandfather. The Fairchild family had been county attorneys for 3 generations. Thomas dug deeper. He found that Harold Fairchild, the grandfather, had served as county attorney from 1889 to 1922, and Harold Fairchild had been married to Elizabeth Wycliffe Preston, the granddaughter of Nathaniel Wycliffe. The family connection was direct. Thomas now understood why the records were sealed. The current county attorney was protecting his ancestors' legacy. But Thomas also realized he had enough evidence to go public without the sealed records. He had the private ledger showing the transfer, the asylum admission patterns, the railroad contract, the will ordering destruction of evidence, the penitentiary records, Judith's Bible with the names. He wrote an academic paper titled Economic Exploitation Through Institutional Commitment, a case study of Riverside Plantation, 1847 to 1856. He submitted it to the Journal of Southern History in May 1963. It was accepted for publication in the fall issue. The article caused an immediate response. The Atlanta Constitution picked it up, running a front-page story. Scholar exposes slavery-era asylum scheme. Other newspapers followed. The Georgia Historical Society issued a statement promising to review all materials related to Riverside Plantation in light of Dr. Hargrave's research. And then, quietly, the Fairmont County Attorney's Office announced that certain historical records previously restricted would be made available to qualified researchers in the interest of historical accuracy. Thomas was granted access in November 1963. The sealed files contained exactly what he'd suspected: correspondence between Nathaniel Wycliffe and Dr. Brennan, arranging the false commitments, letters between Wycliffe and the railroad company negotiating labor rates, detailed ledgers showing payments received from the railroad, and most damning, a private accounting book showing how Wycliffe had invested the profits, purchasing more land, expanding operations, building the grand mansion that still stood at Riverside. All of it built on stolen labor, hidden behind medical certificates and institutional walls. But the files also contained something Thomas hadn't expected. A ledger marked Returns, 1856, 1857. It listed 41 names, the patients returned from the asylum. Next to each name, a destination. 15 listed as Riverside Plantation. 12 listed as transferred to Simmons Estate, Burke County. 14 listed as sold, destination unrecorded, sold. Even though slavery was legal, this was different. These people had been institutionalized as patients, then sold as if they were still property Wycliffe owned. It was a legal impossibility, unless no one was looking, and no one had been. Thomas spent the winter of 1963 compiling a complete list. Using the Riverside Ledger, the asylum notes from Mr. Osborne, the penitentiary records, and Judith's Bible, he reconstructed as many names as possible. He identified 68 individuals with reasonable certainty, 34 who died at the asylum, 27 who were transferred to the penitentiary, 7 who were returned and later sold to other estates. The remaining 5 couldn't be traced. Thomas published a follow-up article in early 1964, this time including the names. He sent copies to historical societies, genealogical organizations, and black churches throughout Georgia, hoping descendants might recognize their ancestors. The responses came slowly at first, then in a flood. Letters from families who'd been searching for generations for proof of their lineage. A woman in Savannah who recognized her great-great-grandfather's name, Marcus, who died in the penitentiary in 1863. A man in Atlanta whose family oral history spoke of an ancestor named Esther, who disappeared during the hard times and was never heard from again. Each connection was a small restoration, a name pulled back from oblivion. But Thomas knew the full truth would never be recovered. The deliberate destruction of records had been too thorough. In March 1964, Thomas received a package from an unexpected source. The return address was simply, "A Friend of Truth, Fairmont County." Inside was a single piece of paper, aged and brittle. It was a page torn from what appeared to be a personal diary, dated June 14, 1857. The handwriting was educated, flowing. "Today marks the final resolution of the matter that has weighed upon my conscience these 9 years. The last of the workers returned from Milledgeville have been disposed of through sale to interests in Alabama and Mississippi, where inquiry is unlikely. The records have been amended at the courthouse, the church registry purged of inconvenient entries, and Dr. Brennan has assured me his files contain nothing that could cause difficulty. I confess a certain relief, though I cannot claim a quiet conscience. What was done for preservation, of order, of property rights, of the natural hierarchy God ordained. Those who would have disrupted that order through rebellion or flight are now beyond such mischief. The new workers acquired from the auctions in Savannah are young, tractable, unburdened by the seditious influences that plagued the previous group. Riverside shall prosper. I commit this account to private pages never to be disclosed. N.W. Nathaniel Wycliffe." This was his confession. Thomas held the page carefully, reading it again and again. Seditious influences disrupted that order. The final piece fell into place. The original workforce hadn't been randomly committed to the asylum. They'd been targeted, probably for organizing, for planning resistance, for attempting escape. And rather than face a potential revolt or mass escape attempt, both of which would have attracted attention and possibly legal consequences, Wycliffe had used the asylum system to disappear them entirely. By the time they were released or transferred, they'd lost years of their lives, their families had been scattered, and any chance of organized resistance was gone. It was a calculated erasure. Thomas never discovered who sent the diary page. He suspected it was someone from the Fairchild family, tired of protecting a shameful legacy. But the sender never identified themselves. In 1966, Thomas Hargrave published a book, The Vanished: How One Georgia Plantation Erased 300 Lives. It became required reading in Southern history courses. The state of Georgia officially acknowledged the asylum scheme and issued a formal apology to descendants. Riverside Plantation revised its tours to include the full, unvarnished history. And in the unmarked cemetery on the east side of the property, the Georgia Historical Society erected a monument, a simple stone marker with the names Thomas had recovered, 68 souls, listed in alphabetical order. At the bottom, an inscription: "These lives were hidden but not lost. These names were taken but now restored. May they be remembered." Lucille Bennett attended the dedication ceremony, her grandmother Clara's Bible held close. She placed a bouquet of white roses at the base of the monument. "For Judith," she said quietly, "and all the ones whose names we'll never know." Thomas stood beside her, looking at the names carved in stone. He thought about the deliberate cruelty of erasure, not just enslaving people but removing even the proof they'd existed. And he thought about the power of memory. How one Bible, one ledger, one person determined to remember could pull the truth back from darkness. The wind moved through the pines, and for a moment, Thomas could almost hear them. The voices that had been silenced, now speaking again through stone and ink. 300 people, not all named but no longer forgotten. The records had tried to erase them. But history, in the end, remembered.